The fist has always been a symbol of strength, power, and revolution, often raised in protest, clenched in resistance, or thrown in desperation when no one will listen. Throughout history, they've represented the will to fight back when words are no longer enough, and it's no different in the 2001 seinen manga by Hideki Arai titled Kiichi. Kiichi is a violent, bizarre, and completely unfiltered seinen manga told across two series, one following Kiichi Somaya as a child, and the other chronicling his rise as a revolutionary adult. Across nearly 200 chapters, viewing the world through the naive glance of a youngster, we get one of the most radical, disturbing, and unforgettable stories about a boy who, in the silence of everyone else's inaction, decides to become the person who does something, even if it means setting the world on fire. Right from birth, Kiichi has been an absolute little shit. Our first introduction to him is as a 3-year-old in kindergarten who consistently knocks out the teeth of other children at his school. The first 9 chapters of the series specifically are quite episodic and mainly take place from the perspective of Kiichi's parents, who struggle to manage his sporadic and aggressive lifestyle. Multiple times, Kiichi is found leaving the house and setting off on his own little adventures, and though he rarely utters a word, his actions are reminiscent of the childhood in which everything felt so grand, impressive, and utterly fascinating. He's also just a straight-up gangster. Kiichi throws hands for any and all reasons, fights kids older or younger than him, and if you piss him off in the slightest bit, he will slug you because that's just who he is. His character that gets established in these short 9 chapters is one of a unique kid, one who doesn't stand for injustice and will use violence to get his point across. He's also constantly learning and picking up ideas from everything around him, like when he's watching the news about some guy in a Mickey Mouse hat breaking into the South Korean airport, and aptly decides to recreate that incident. This part of the story is slow, mainly focusing on his parents' inability to properly take care of their child, and unlike other manga, there's no real hook, no real twist, and nothing necessarily grabbing your attention to keep you reading. That is, until chapter 10 rolls around and the series starts bearing its fangs as the seinen manga it is, starting the second volume off with a wild turn of events and altering the course of Kiichi's life and the manga's story permanently. If you haven't read the series yet, now's a good chance to start before I start talking about stuff that truly matters. I definitely think it's one of the most underrated seinen manga out there, and the more I read over it and understand it, the more I got to appreciate it as a story. Kiichi Somaya is a child of prophecy, or at least that's what his parents believe, as his mother was recommended by a shaman to give birth on a specific date via a C-section, foreseeing the child would grow up to be a man of unparalleled virility. Virility can be defined as the quality of having strength, energy, and a strong sex drive. Manliness, everything that defines and underlies what it means to be a man or to be masculine. Which is a really interesting take, and depending on how you look at it, could be a way that the author was playing on issues with gender stereotypes, which is disturbingly far ahead of its time, with this manga originally coming out in 2001. The series constantly portrays Kiichi as strong in the way that, unlike the other kids, he never ever cries. Throughout his time in the kindergarten, he never once sheds a tear, not when the kids leave bite marks all over his body, when he's in bloody fights, or when he witnesses a kitten get brutally run over by a car. One of the weirdest quotes within the series comes from one of the other kids' mothers, who describes Kiichi's 3-year-old naked body as sexy. That's weird on a multitude of levels, but I'd like to chop it up as Kiichi falling under this prophecy that originated from his birth and the masculinity he symbolizes even as a child. He represents manliness by never complaining, rarely speaking out, and doing what he wishes, using his strength to keep others around him in check, fighting against what he deems to be wrong. However, Kiichi's symbolism as strength ends up crumbling and breaking down when, on a trip to the aquarium with his family, Kiichi's parents end up in a tragic event which ends both their lives. A mentally unwell man who has evidently lost it by his head banging against the signboard lashes out at multiple people with a knife, ending both Kiichi's father and mother. Their deaths are fast, quick, not overtly dramatic or drawn out, and in just a single moment, Kiichi is left to face the vast world completely alone. Being the man of prophesized virility, of unparalleled strength, yet also a child who doesn't understand or grasp the meaning behind life and death, Kiichi just can't respond in grief. The 3-year-old is instead enraged. He's upset and he doesn't understand why his family is just unresponsive on the ground. He raises his fist in the air in protest because he's pissed the fuck off. He doesn't think he should be sad. Why would he be sad? He doesn't even know what sad is. He's a man of power. He doesn't get sad. His parents should be up and moving like he is, yet they aren't. And he has nowhere to direct his anger towards. So all he does is raise his fist in the air, directing his resentment towards the world. This tantrum continues on to the next chapter, where Kiichi is seen obstinately stuck with his hand still in the air, unwavering. Even when his grandparents bring him to the funeral and try to explain to him that his parents have passed, he doesn't cry. He simply covers up his ears and ignores them. To me, this isn't merely a child who doesn't understand or grasp the situation yet. If anything, it's someone who knows what's happened, is aware, but is trying to mediate his emotions and not accept the reality of what it is. His face, which seems to be filled with anger and stubbornness, is really just a mask Kiichi is donning to show that he's okay, which is why I brought up his prophesization of virility and why he's a symbolism of masculinity. His actions are eerily similar to something akin to the mental health stigma and kind of perception behind male emotions that are connected to the strength and power that Kiichi is supposed to represent. Someone who can't be seen crying, someone who can't show emotion and has to be strong and powerful to those around him. A person who can't have any cracks and can't be seen vulnerable, even if they're just a 3-year-old who lost everything. This is kind of a crazy pull, but while writing the script I watched a Jubilee video called "Can 6 Men Make Each Other Cry?" Basically, in the video, these 6 random guys have to try and make each other cry within 30 minutes. The first thing they do is, without speaking to each other, make themselves cry individually using their own thoughts, which does not work. I know this is a YouTube video, I know it could very well be scripted, but either way it speaks volumes about the current situation and how men want to and are supposed to be perceived when regarding their vulnerability. First, none of these guys want to fucking share their experiences or really get out there, and that's part to just meeting each other for the first time, but I genuinely think a lot of it has to do with the idea behind male stereotypes and what a man is supposed to represent. Kiichi is a goddamn 3-year-old written from 2001 who has always been seen alone and is never seen as weak. He's never vulnerable and he's never exposed to his peers as lesser or unstable because of negative emotions regarding sadness. The only time he's ever overly expressive in his actions is when he's mad, which can be slightly concerning, especially if Kiichi is used here to symbolize masculinity and virility and the only emotion he overtly expresses is anger, but that's just another whatever story. In a way, Kiichi is viewed as everything society wants to see him as, a man who is sexy, easily angered, and uses violence to solve a lot of issues while never showing his own weaknesses or emotional vulnerability. Now, I'm not saying that every guy is some stone-cold, straight-faced Sigma alpha male, but the point is that Kiichi is supposed to be an unparalleled man of virility, the culminating peak of what the author thinks the world sees as a masculine man, and in this case, I think he's absolutely right. That's why in this Jubilee video, these guys all represent lesser expressions of masculinity shown through Kiichi. In a way, these 6 men represent what it means to be masculine, to be a man, and to fall into the gender role that you are, conforming to what everyone else is like. Even though Kiichi was written over 20 years ago, a lot of the issues it explores still feel painfully relevant, but since then we've also positively changed in the way society views masculinity and emotional vulnerability, especially in recent years. Kiichi shows the cracks behind his masculinity symbolism, especially after the funeral where he really has to come to terms with his parents' death. He's thrown into a coma-like state, sleeping for hours on end and being unresponsive, not crying or making any sound. As a child, he is showing masculinity's inability to come to terms or show themselves to be vulnerable, a defense mechanism which tries and handles the situation by emotionally killing oneself and only causing further damage. However, this facade breaks and the boy who is supposed to be the symbol of virility crumbles as he walks across his grandmother watching an old tape, the original tape of Kiichi's parents and the tale of how they first met, which forces Kiichi to face the reality of an experience that he won't be able to have again. This is the first monumental moment in Kiichi's life, and one that only starts the shift from Kiichi's character away or maybe even closer to the existence he is prophesized to be. Kiichi, who is taken to the park, somehow gets away from his grandparents once more and ends up lost again. However, this time when homeless people tell him to go home or passerbys ask Kiichi if he's lost, he gives a negative response, because he isn't lost and because he has no more home to go back to. What follows Kiichi's disappearance can be summed up as his descent into the real world. A child who has lost everything now sparks a nationwide manhunt and news story that raises his status to a figure of prominence within the manga's world. He basically becomes a celebrity because of the single arc, one that's broken into several smaller stories, but all of them circle the same core, the brutal reality of human nature and Kiichi's first real attempt at defining what kind of person he wants to become in response to it. Through his interactions with the homeless, Kiichi witnesses the best and worst of people, their selfishness, their desperation, their moments of kindness, and it forces him to start building a moral compass in a world that clearly lacks one. Kiichi, who ran away from home, stumbles across a lady who lives in a rundown shack, and she eventually takes Kiichi in as an attempt to retribute herself for her past and make herself feel better. Like Kiichi, she has no real place to call home, yet she finds solace in the idea that a young child gives her affection and in turn lies to Kiichi, saying that he has to wait for his mother and father to come pick him up. Kiichi, who is still yet to grasp the concept of death, believes that if he stays with Momo, his parents will eventually come for him. He starts living in secret with her under the disdain of another homeless man named Tetsu who sees the dark reality of the situation. Momo takes care of Kiichi like her own child, but she's merely compensating for her past, using Kiichi to fortify her own feelings of sorrow. This previous mother, who was supposed to be taking care of her own child, left home to lustfully engage in activities with another man, and as a result lost both her kid and marriage. Now with the introduction of an impressionable young boy who sees Momo as his auntie and new guardian, Momo feels fulfilled just at the addition of Kiichi in her life. While Kiichi stays hidden from the prying eyes of those around them, he ends up being caught by those who wish to claim the missing child reward. But with the help of a man named Maeda, Tetsu and Momo get the opportunity to escape from the police. Maeda is a strange and disturbing character whose motives and reasoning for helping Kiichi are far from altruistic. One of the recurring themes in this arc is how most people who cross paths with the kid don't help him out of kindness, but rather to serve their own emotional voids or personal goals. Momo clings to him in an attempt to fill the absence left by her deceased child, while Maeda, a thrill-seeking killer, uses Kiichi to satisfy his own twisted desires. And through all these self-serving actions, desperate attempts to fill holes in their broken lives, Kiichi becomes the thread that ties them all together. Maeda brings Kiichi to kill his next target, a gangster who resembles Kiichi's father and who Kiichi somewhat associates with his dad. While escaping from the police, Maeda brings Kiichi, who serves as a temporary distraction for the gangster, and proceeds to gun down the man in front of him, enthralled by the look of despair produced within the child's eyes. The build-up to this scene and all the characters Kiichi interacts with show the depressing reality and situation of a lot of people, the twisted human nature and foregoing of relationships to seek personal or monetary gain, and Kiichi, who gets swept up in the middle of it all. Through the shooting of the gangster who represents his dad and the similar smell of perfume that he recognizes at the scene of the crime, Kiichi comes to the realization that his parents have long been gripped by death. After this event to flee from the cops, Tetsu and Momo take Kiichi, with Tetsu wishing to return him to his grandparents. However, the traumatized child seeks for immediate comfort from Momo, only intensifying her desire to take care of him more. Ultimately, Kiichi ends up staying with Momo, as Tetsu leaves him with a small piece of advice that will end up forming a part of Kiichi's core identity and solve another piece of his puzzle to shape who he later becomes. Using the money from Maeda and other various sources, Kiichi goes with Momo to meet an old friend named Akimoto, who gives them refuge in her apartment. Akimoto is the mistress of a man named Kenji, who rents the apartment that Kiichi and Momo can stay in. Her first impressions are not the best. To be anything, she's kind of a dick, and she does some really fucking weird stuff, but she also ends up becoming a core component of Kiichi's established beliefs in life. The second half of Kiichi's disappearance is depressing and outright disturbing in some moments, utilizing sex as a means to display humanity's most corrupt moments and greatest sins. For example, Momo's relapse into her past self and inability to learn from her mistakes. She repeats her actions which originally led to the loss of her child and family, falling for Akimoto's man Kenji, and in the end leaving Kiichi behind. In an extremely warped and cartoonishly disgusting panel, we see her and Kenji's horrible mesh of character and what ultimately leads to her leaving the 4-year-old in the hands of her old friend Akimoto. Kiichi, who has now been abandoned multiple times, intentionally or not, clashes with his idea of strength, or rather builds it up, because he's 4 fucking years old. He's been through a stabbing, a shooting, basically a kidnapping, and is broken. He only knows how to protect himself, yet he's constantly told that he's a child and he needs to be around an adult. Which is where he gets his life-changing advice from Akimoto, words that cement themselves in his mind and guide him for a large portion of the series. She tells him that being alone is good. Life can be painful and full of suffering, and most of the time you will not be happy. In the end, you'll feel like you're living in spite of yourself, and there's no alternative other than to keep on living. However, this is indicative of the life that your parents have blessed you with, the opportunity you alone as an individual have been granted, and if you live such a life, you will end up saddening those who gave birth to you. But if you can tell your parents in heaven that you're fine, even if you're alone, you will be happy, and if you are thankful for the life you've been given, then it's a victory. And this line resonates with Kiichi, who has just come to terms with his parents' death. This idea of victory, which comes from being alone, being strong, and not being burdened down by the harsh realities of existence, ultimately brings happiness to his parents and fulfills his current life. While Akimoto tries to return Kiichi, he ends up wandering into the woods, only to go missing for another long set of months, surviving on his own by fishing and using lighters to start fires. Eventually, he's found when he can't fish anymore and returns back to civilization, where he gives off a speech in a press conference that solidifies his story within the hearts of all citizens across the country. His proclamation that everybody is alone, being alone is awesome, important, and that he is happy to live alone. From the citizens of Japan to his grandparents who have been trying to find him for months, this is absolutely absurd. But Kiichi's speech and ideal of life is formed by what he went through, the teachings from Kenji on how to fish, and survival being equivalent to being a man, his consistent abandonment by those around him, and his desire to live on his own in the forest for months. However, as we progress further through the story, his speech and his claim to live alone remain the same, but it also takes upon another perspective, something that will lead Kiichi to further his impact on the world and reflect how he views the current status of society. Kiichi ends up living with his grandparents, and we jump to his young adolescence starting at a new elementary school. The first thing Kiichi says when introducing himself to the class is to stay the hell away from him. This is obviously a reflection of his childhood and can be interpreted as his desire to stay true to what Akimoto told him, that being alone is equivalent to strength and also winning. However, he also tells his classmates to do whatever they want, that he doesn't want friends nor enemies, which is something new. Kiichi, as a child in kindergarten, was already shown to have a strong aversion to injustice, and proved his points by using excessive violence. His upbringing, especially during his homeless arc, has only improved his distrust in society and disliking to those around him, which is why his speech from earlier about claiming he wants to be alone, but neither wants enemies or friends, is unique, as he's trying to represent a more neutral stance now. This point in time also introduces us to a few major characters, specifically Kai, the student who is far ahead of his classmates in terms of intellect and maturity. Kai is first introduced as the leader of his class, and even may seem like an opposition to Kiichi in the way he tries to test Kiichi out and discern his true motivations. One of the most interesting things here is that Kai tries to see how neutral Kiichi can be, or if it is even possible for Kiichi to retain his neutrality, especially to the injustices occurring around him. Misato is the second major person involved in Kiichi's adolescence and represents the power imbalance of society, as well as Kiichi's hate towards the weak. The injustices that Kiichi recognizes and the things that appear in his class only further expand on his original statement of wanting to be alone, not because he actually wants to be alone in a physical sense, but rather that he doesn't want to get involved in the social and political interactions that occur all around him. The bullying and ostracization of Misato is an example of this, and also proof that Kiichi can't remain a neutral party, as it's just not possible, which is stated by Kai. You can either accept the injustice as it is and ignore it, which in turn leads you to be part of the problem, or choose to fight against the wave of everybody else. Kiichi can't remain neutral and stay in the same mindset as those around him. Wanting to be alone while being neutral isn't possible, especially when those around you are affected. Kiichi's desire to remain neutral and uninvolved isn't just some childish whim. It reflects a broader mindset seen in modern-day society. Many people adopt a similar stance when it comes to real-world injustices, politics, or even community issues. Whether it's not voting, staying silent during moments of public controversy, or claiming to be apolitical, this stance of detachment feels safe or even principled. But as pointed out in the manga, neutrality is often an illusion because by doing nothing, you're still making a choice. You're enabling the current structure to continue unchallenged. This core message is a large root of what makes up the entire manga, mainly focusing on the lack of activity from people as a collective, which ultimately stems as a lack of initiative from individuals. During gym class while playing dodgeball, Misato ends up getting sniped in the face intentionally, which causes her nose to bleed. However, no one ends up saying anything, and even the teacher doesn't bat an eye. Instead, they play it off as a pure mistake and try to stop Kiichi from throwing a tantrum, but this only further enrages Kiichi, who understands that no one in this class is going to step up. No one in that gym building would do anything to step away from the crowd or push forward against things they deem morally wrong, and as such, they must all be punished for their wrongdoings, which Kiichi does by headbutting the teacher and then proceeding to hit every single student in the face, including Kai and the victim Misato. His original line of "being alone is awesome" expands to the idea of distancing yourself from the group conformity that takes place in every social situation, by being able to devise your own thoughts and judge actions using your own moral compass, not going under the notions of every other person in the room, and forging your own personal opinion that leads your own actions. Kiichi at this point in the series is supposed to be a representation of individualism, to show the person who takes a step forward against things he sees are clearly wrong. It's nice that it's at a classroom level to represent what's wrong at a smaller population, while still acknowledging the group conformity problem. But Hideki Arai decides to not stop here, and an uncomfortable plot descends, continuing to focus on the wrongdoings that occur around Misato, the truly most misfortunate child in the series. Misato, the girl who was bullied at school, is also used by her father, who sells his 11-year-old daughter's body to older men in the form of child prostitution. A lot of stuff happens because of Misato's prostitution, mainly the resolve from her to ask Kiichi for help, her desire and cry out to live, and yet her self-conflict as to not forsake her father, the very man who torments her at the same time. This conflict escalates when we learn about who Misato's clients actually are, people of very high stature and power, and one of the running prime minister candidates. Kiichi, who has been exposed to humanity's corruption at an individual level, now begins recognizing the problems within a collective society, and with the help of a reporter named Ishizuka, Kiichi and Kai work together to create a video documentary exposing the crimes that Misato's father has committed, including the list of politicians and big shots linked to the police that are all clients. Chapter 63 in particular makes a big point of expanding on Kiichi's views and who the real enemy is in this distrustful situation. In a conversation between Ishizuka and his superior Moroka, who are discussing the documentary, Moroka comments on how the prostitution of minors isn't something people care about nowadays. And I do think there's some truth to that, not specifically the child prostitution part, but more the act of ignorance and unfazed conscience of society when met with undoubtable sins. This is a big importance in regards to the story of Kiichi, the fact that people don't act, especially if they themselves haven't experienced any injustice or wrongdoings. If you personally haven't experienced any misfortune, if you aren't subject to the hardships created by our shaped society, and if you enjoy the comfort of a culture that turns a blind eye to injustice, then you won't feel incited to do anything. Moroka brings up the point that this case isn't going to go big because it's prostitution involving a minor, but rather because of the concern involving a person of higher power. Our society, which gave up on its conscience, is something that Kiichi is against, and in a way the news and media is driven purely by a capitalistic perspective, with people focusing on what directly affects them, in this case the politician. The documentary filming continues as Kiichi goes around with Kai, Ishizuka, and crew to confront and get direct confessions or evidence from the list of clients. They first stop by the most obvious target and the criminal behind the whole scandal being Misato's father. Kiichi is known for his violent tendencies, his retributions on those using his fists, and has previously fought Misato's dad for these very deeds. But this time when he sees him, he doesn't actually hit him. Instead, he stares down Misato's father and, upon recalling various conversations, raises his fist in the air, the very symbolic and iconic move he has been doing since he was a toddler, with anger seething out of his eyes. When Ishizuka asks Kiichi afterwards why he didn't hit Misato's father, he simply replies that he felt nothing. What Kiichi felt wasn't anger towards her dad, but anger towards something else. Something that was out of control, not in the hands of her father alone. His crimes were merely a result of a greater system that further pushed his actions. This is probably the next biggest core idea behind Kiichi as a character and what he truly stands for, to abolish the current system which allows behaviors like this to continue, with high-standing people abusing their power and money for their sick desires. Misato's dad is just a cog in the machine, who unfortunately, like his daughter, are easily replaceable. The interviews continue with Kiichi confronting politicians, businessmen, and entrepreneurs for what they've done, if they have any guilty conscience, and outletting his rage towards their actions. We watch this interspersing story unfold of Kiichi using his 11-year-old body to beat the living fuck out of these monsters, while we see the progress of politician Shinson running for office. The same Shinson who is one of Misato's perpetrators and the client with the highest position of power that Kiichi seeks after. Now, while things seem to be going well for Kiichi and crew, there are some slip-ups and consequences for their actions, with various factions attempting to silence and usher them in a different direction. However, these warnings only added more fuel to the fire, and further pushed Kiichi down the path of no return. In Chapter 70, the tone of the story, which has already been extremely uncomfortable, only dives deeper in the form of Kiichi's grand plan, devising a scheme to upset Japan as an entirety in a similar fashion to the way that he beat up every single person in his gym class. Terrorism. Kiichi, Kai, and Kiichi's old business partner set out to the National Diet Building and proclaim they've taken a hostage using a real pistol. In an attempt to get people to hear their voices and recognize them, Kiichi commits an act of terrorism, a retaliation against those who tried to silence him. After a series of arguments between politician Shinson, the police department, and multiple news stations, Kiichi, Kai, and Ishizaku manage to finally get their documentary aired on live television while they're still in front of the Diet Building with a hostage. The documentary, which is laid bare for each citizen to see, exposes the harrowing truth of the matter, but that isn't the important part. It's not the actual act that occurred in which the author is trying to display what truly matters here. Yes, the child prostitution was horrible, but it could have been easily replaced with any other crime to exhibit what Hideki Arai was trying to say. The corrupt system and society which allowed such a crime to occur isn't the only issue, it's also the fact that no one else stepped up. The single person who actually took action upon seeing this was a goddamn elementary school student. In his riveting speech explaining the injustice that this system is and the lacking effort of every person at an individualistic level, lightning flashes as Kiichi raises his fist into the pouring rain, and much to the surprise of everyone watching, he surrenders. There's a lot to unpack in the scene alone, but it basically builds off of everything the early parts of the manga have been working on since the very beginning. During the documentary, after the flashy and aggressive scenes of Kiichi assaulting the various pedophiles, we are met with the message to wake up and get angry. Perfectly fitting for a story about children revolting against their country while nailing the core message of the manga. In chapter 66, Kai states that a naive glance is often better to see the atrocities of this world than a look jaded by years of compromise. Kiichi, who has lived his entire life facing injustice and wrongdoings by the system of society, is pissed with the way the world currently operates. Once again, if someone hasn't personally experienced wrongdoings against them, it's hard for them to act, which is a big issue and what the ending message of the documentary is trying to say. Stop turning a blind eye, stop letting things occur without stepping up, and stop being an assistant to lesser evils by letting them occur so simply. It's a strong message, but it's also not really applicable to every single person. Kiichi is trying to encourage everybody to take that first step against evil, be more aware, and just be your own person with your own thoughts and opinions, not getting swept away by the currents of society. It's a simple idea, but it's really difficult to execute. Not everyone has the capability to get a gun from a Yakuza, gather a crew, and fake a hostage with a homeless guy in a van to take over part of a governmental area and spread a document exposing the crimes of famous politicians. That's just not realistic. It's a very idealistic way of viewing things. Just because you're aware of things going awry doesn't mean you have a solution or way to actually fix it, and oftentimes trying to intervene in a situation you're not well versed in can lead to greater failure. But I think the message still stands important and relevant, especially if you don't take it at the extremely exaggerated level it's presented as. Of course, it's situational, and in the case of the 11-year-old Kiichi and many other people, they don't have the ability provided to make any meaningful change within their country. Kiichi ultimately despises people because of the system that guides the way they do things. Money, media, law, and strength, the four pillars which Kai refers to, are the very four things that guide the way society plays out. In a way, Kiichi is directly arguing against the idea of capitalism and fighting a revolution towards a society away from the guidance of worldly ideals. After this whole event, when things calm down a little, Kiichi asks Kai the way to change the law and state, and Kai brings up that he may have to act like some of the greatest dictators to have ever walked on Earth. Kiichi, under the desire and direct influence to change the world, recognizes what he wants to do, needs to do, and who he wants to be. This act of terrorism and revolt against the state is only the beginning of his journey as things escalate at a much larger and more important grandeur scale within the manga's sequel, Kiichi Versus. While part 1 of Kiichi ramped things up, especially towards the end, its sequel follows Kiichi as an adult with a much greater following and along with it a higher level of power. While I do have issues with the sequel, like how much more word heavy it can be and its extremely slow start, it has a lot more important and memorable peaks as well as overall implications to what the story is truly about. The manga begins with the life of Michio, a man who struggles financially, having to take care of his mother who suffers from a degenerative disease. He is burdened by unemployment due to the government's restructuring, as well as his constant need to take care of his mom, an issue that the government couldn't assist him with either because they were in debt or couldn't afford time to give workers for Michio's care insurance. Their stark reality is laid bare in some brief but very impactful panels that show the despair encompassing the caretaker role Michio is forced into. This was probably one of the most memorable moments within the series in regards to a realistic problem that I think is only going to be increasingly prevalent in later years. Now, I'm from Canada. I'm currently studying in hopes to get a bachelor's in kinesiology and possibly go for a master's in physiotherapy. And one of the issues I've learned from multiple classes is Canada's aging population problem. The largest generation in Canada, the baby boomers, represents almost a quarter of the country's entire population. So people born in 1946 to 1965, or ages 56 to 75, make up 25% of the entire country. There's a lot of problems that come with this, but the biggest issue this represents and a great cause of it is the increased longevity of humanity, which is both a pro and a con. I mean, it's the first time we've been living this long as people. As a result, we've been introduced to a bunch more chronic diseases that are really hard to manage. These aren't illnesses that can be cured by just giving someone medicine. They are a result of the body's gradual degradation that pretty much persists until death and can only really be fixed by having a solid foundation from exercise and healthy habits. But not everyone has a healthy lifestyle and can afford to live a healthy lifestyle. A lot of Canada's population ends up with degenerative chronic diseases that greatly impact their life. Now that there's such a large population of retired elderly people who need help to sustain life, there aren't enough available facilities, and people similarly struggle to take care of their own parents or grandparents as a result. Michio, who clearly struggles as the lone son of his mother, can't even work and basically spends all his time as a personal caretaker, which isn't very far from the reality of Canada. It's a result of our great advancements in quality of life and medical achievements, but also the glaring flaw as a result of pushing our lives to the very limit. Now, the manga isn't trying to point out this issue specifically, it's instead highlighting the government's response in helping those who are in these situations, which isn't great in the manga or in Canada either. I recently watched a video by Bofang Chang that pointed out extremely disturbing facts regarding Canada's Medical Assistance in Dying program, or MAID for short. Basically, Canada implemented an assisted euthanasia program in 2016, which is useful for those who are physically suffering and are most likely dying soon. However, it gradually expanded its methods and removed the qualification for a person to have a foreseeable death. So if someone was suffering and enduring from something, they could meet the requirements to apply for the MAID program even if their death wasn't insured. What this resulted in was people who shouldn't really be qualified for the MAID requirements ending up in this program or recommended to the program by doctors anyways. Bofang Chang gives a few really good and really horrific examples of people who have issues that could have received adequate services and living conditions for a better life, but instead were offered to apply for the MAID program as a primary suggestion. That's basically the government just saying they won't spend time and money to help you and would rather have you die instead. It gets even worse when he talks about how high our rates of MAID are compared to California, which implemented the same service at the same time. But go watch his video if you want to hear more details about it. It's a great video that covers a lot more about Canada besides this sole problem, and I also didn't fact check any of this info, so if it's all wrong, you can just go blame him. Regardless, what this video talked about was eerily similar to the exact situation Michio goes through. While taking care of his mother, he applied for care insurance, but because of a multitude of complicated factors regarding finances and the government's debt issues, Michio and his mom's suffering continues while not receiving any adequate help at all. As a result, with no more money and his mother barely coherent, Michio goes to Mount Fuji to commit a double suicide. This is a similar situation and unfortunate outcome to Canada's MAID program, the government either directly or indirectly leading its people down the path to an easier alternative. This short story about Michio and his mother only takes place within the first 3 chapters of Kiichi verses. To some it may seem unimportant, but it paints the picture for how the rest of the manga is going to play out. A focus on individualism and the issues that occur among those who suffer as a result of a system which doesn't care about them. Those who abide by the law, live a righteous and justful life, end up suffering the most, facing backlash, and overall not succeeding. The greatest example of this is Mr. Kurita and his meat company. This is the problem which the sequel spends majority of its focus on, as it's an individual issue that affects a larger group of people at the exact same time. After the government abolishes a law surrounding meat quality standards, a mad cow disease starts affecting livestock. A company called Green Pastures starts repackaging foreign imported meat as Japanese meat in an attempt to maximize profit, and all its employees are forced to comply. However, Mr. Kurita attempts to break free from his conformity and exposes Green Pastures for their fraudery. However, Green Pastures twists the situation, and as a result, media attention regarding the entire situation goes down, and the Kurita company, which faces backlash against Green Pastures and their supporters, quickly starts falling apart. Mr. Kurita, who only tried to do what was right, ends up ostracized by everyone he once trusted, so he tries to seek Kiichi's help as a result. This is where we're introduced to the Kiichi Company, a group of people who follow Kiichi's ideals and provide support to him in various ways. The company's overall goal is to create a better country, but because it's a company, because there's laws, it's quite bound by the state and money, limited in the ways it can actually provide support. Kiichi himself admits that when it comes to changing the world, his actions are superficial and limited by his upholding morals, as well as the limits of what the state tolerates the Kiichi Company to do. Mr. Kurita, who has nothing, seeks out the help of Kiichi and requests money to keep his company afloat after exposing the issues within his sector of business. After an extremely long and detailed overview on the situation, Kiichi decides to stand with him, as Mr. Kurita followed the same policy of Kiichi, to not focus on the gains or losses of an action, but to do what is evident. However, this leads us into the clash of philosophies between Kiichi and his second-hand man business partner Kai. To truly create a better world and ultimately change the country for good, Kai has been plotting with Kiichi, ultimately planning to uproot the state by putting Kiichi in position as prime minister. However, Kiichi is a spontaneous person. He's purely idealistic and wants to save everyone no matter the costs. He basically can't become prime minister without sacrificing or losing something for fitting to a lesser evil. Kiichi and Kai's first major argument occurs around Mr. Kurita, as Kiichi wants to support him, while Kai argues against it as a negative influence on their power and funds to run in the campaign. This is a cool parallel between Kiichi and Kai from their childhoods, echoing their feelings that they both project from when they were kids. Kiichi has always been a man of integrity and refuses to turn a blind eye to those in need. Even when he was a kid and tried to maintain neutrality at school, he couldn't look away from the problems occurring around Misato. Kai was the one who originally questioned Kiichi's neutrality, and he's also a character who will sacrifice what's necessary to achieve his life goals and desires. Their clash of realism and idealism is what ultimately leads to the downfall of the Kiichi Company and the evolution of Kiichi as a character to what he has never been able to be. Kiichi and Mr. Kurita hijack a television broadcast where Kiichi makes his first step towards revolution through his speech or declaration of war upon the world. Kiichi proceeds to bring up the Kurita case as he hands the microphone to his new partner to explain the issues that he's experienced. However, it's not his personal situation that he goes to great lengths to explain, but rather the injustices he's seen that he can't look away from. His anger towards the rest of the world, who keeps letting everything get worse without doing anything, to pave a new path for the younger generation like his own grandson, and fight till he dies so that his ideal will finally become reality. But the crowd who just watched this old man ramble and vent off his anger responded in a way one would probably expect. They don't care. They aren't there for Kiichi or for this old meat business owner, and so they give a round of applause in which they don't know what they're applauding. In response to this, Kiichi takes the microphone back and tells them, the crowd directly, "It is you who are my enemies." His anger directed not at the scandal, but at the people who kept Mr. Kurita held down, and the hand he needed which wasn't lent to him. Kiichi yells at the world to stop believing, stop listening, and stop obeying the country, the police, to religion, to law, deities, Buddha, newspapers, TV, media, and to not believe in the Kiichi Company either. In a way, this is a huge callback to Kiichi's original anger and fury towards the group conformity that took place in his elementary gym class, at the bullies who got away with evil despite their quite obvious intentions. No one in that class took the effort or even tried to acknowledge the issue, simply abiding by the problems that were occurring, accepting it as part of the world. Kiichi has always been fighting for things that he thinks will never change, the way people think and perceive this world, which is why he denounces a bunch of shit people believe in, because he wishes for those who think and act for themselves. Like how Mr. Kurita, regardless of loss or profit, pursued the bringing of green pastures to justice. After the large event, Kiichi and Kai have a talk in Mr. Kurita's house about their and the Kiichi Company's future. Kai, who has been following Kiichi's ideal to change Japan, tells Kiichi about his long-term goal of positioning him as prime minister. What this entails is that they have to make current sacrifices and avoid involving themselves in situations so they can ensure their long-term goal of political power. But this doesn't bode well with Kiichi, who outright disagrees with this idea and argues about all the people who will be suffering while they pursue their change of Japan. And so, in regular Kiichi fashion, instead of going the long way and changing the country correctly through law, power, and finance, Kiichi asks Kai a question. A war, a revolution, or whatever it's called, how do I do it? If they're gonna rip everything out, then they might as well remove things down to the very last roots. This seems like a great segue to move the story towards Kiichi and Kai's revolution and war towards the country of Japan, but instead the manga takes a vastly different approach. Instead of falling down a more typical story of Kiichi taking over the world through power and force, the dictatorship which he was once hinted towards, it instead chases Kiichi down a far different path than I expected, while still creating one of the greatest characters to ever exist. Not a tale of domination, but a descent into something far more intimate. The humanization of Kiichi Somea. But to truly understand Kiichi as a character, I must first explain to you the story of Samson. The story of Samson refers to the Book of Judges from the Bible, detailing the life of a man named Samson, given birth from a barren woman, and blessed by God to have extraordinary strength, living out his life as a Nazirite. A lot happens during Samson's story, which represents ideas of temptations and weaknesses among humans, being a core representation of flaws and desires which burden even the strongest of men. One of Samson's greatest sins is his consistent search for lust, ending up seduced and enthralled by Delilah, a woman sent by the Philistines to deceive him. After revealing that his power lies in his uncut hair, Delilah has it shaved while he sleeps, stripping him of his strength. Captured, blinded, and humiliated, Samson becomes a trophy for his enemies, but in a final act of redemption, he prays to God for one last surge of strength. He pushes apart the pillars of the temple he's held in, collapsing it and killing himself along with thousands of Philistines. Now, I'm not religious. This is the first time I've read this story, which the manga directly alludes to through the play and introduction of the Haramita theater group. Beyond the direct allusion, there are a ton of other connections that could be made in which Kiichi represents similar tribulations to Samson's story. First, both are blessed from birth. Kiichi prophesies to be a man of unparalleled virility, while Samson is just super strong and a literal child of God with his Nazirite vow. Samson's story, which reflects the human characteristics and flaws of an unyielding person, can be reflected in Kiichi's love for the leader of Haramita theater group, Aya. Kiichi, whose unbreakable will has shown no weaknesses throughout the entire manga, starts to crumble and fade away when he meets the love of his life. Similar to Samson, he starts changing at this moment from an unstoppable force into a young man in love. With the start of Volume 5, we get this beautiful cover, which is obviously a direct reference to Samson's final moments, where he pushes apart the temple and avenges himself, destroying and killing thousands. Kiichi, who falls in love with Aya, similarly gets his hair cut by her, and his goal of destroying society is in a way put off by her, just like Delilah stops Samson from killing Philistines. Kiichi Versus is all about Kiichi finding out what he wants to do with his life. Though the structure and what is happening generally follows his original goal of changing the world and showing people what's wrong with their society, in reality what's truly occurring is Kiichi's self-realization that he's never managed to live his own life. When Kiichi has his hair cut, when he meets Aya and the theater group, his goals change. He doesn't return to the company, he stops talking to Kai, he ends up spending a lot of his time in an attempt not to change the world, though that's what he says, but in reality to save the woman he loves the most. This is a controversial conclusion and a decision of his character, and it's understandable when you see what he's done this entire time, what he's capable of, and the fact that he possibly has the power to change the world. However, in the end, he chooses Aya as his one sole reason for living, and she is what guides his actions through the rest of the series. Unlike Samson, Kiichi doesn't have super strength, nor the power to beat a lion to death with his bare hands. No, Kiichi's extraordinary powers equal to that of Samson are his status as a symbol for hope, strength, and change. Throughout the series, he constantly represents hope through his various survival in life-threatening situations, as well as hope in people who wish for a new, better generation. He represents the hope that the world still has people willing to take a step forward. Strength is a pretty self-explanatory symbolism for Kiichi. He constantly uses physical force to solve issues, he's extremely headstrong, and the one action he is seen doing throughout the series so much is his raised fist, a definitive symbol of strength and power. Lastly, change. Kiichi steps forward, he does what he believes to be right, doing what others won't even dare to think of because he wants his country to be better. He can't stand the current situation, so he's always seeking for change no matter the route or methods he has to take to get there. These powers, these abilities, and what Kiichi represents as a person are slowly lost after his hair is cut. He loses the extraordinary brilliance that he once possessed when he was a symbol, falling from his position as above others to the average human, as he is infatuated with Aya, the woman who treats him like a regular person. Now, this isn't to say that Kiichi basically loses his characteristics and unique level of genius. What he actually lost from his love with Aya was the drive he needed to keep going. The change also isn't instant like Samson, as the story continues a long while even after he gets his haircut, so it's not like he just loses everything right away. He's still the genius child prophesized from birth, it's just his objective has now changed, which is proven in a scene shortly after he gets his haircut. Kiichi has now decided to assist the Haramita Theater Group's plan to upset the state, preparing to capture instead of kill a few prominent figures within Japan to scare the world and leave a lasting impact on the nation. The Haramita Theater Group consists of people who were off-put by the nation and cast aside by society due to unfortunate circumstances, and as a result they are seeking revenge against the entire nation as a whole. But to accomplish this with a few scared and half-resolved actors would be a tough challenge, so he seeks out the support of hardened underworld criminals. But they don't trust or don't believe in his cause yet, because it seems his reasoning, which Kiichi tells them is purely for love, is not reliable enough. So as the blessed man that he is, Kiichi, in front of the 4 underworld professionals, grabs a fully loaded revolver, takes out only one of the bullets, and with 4 out of 5 of the chambers stocked, jams the pistol barrel to his head and squeezes the trigger down, reminding them that it isn't about the gains or losses in this operation, and simply invites them to come and play with him. This is one of the coolest peaks and moments in the series period. The drive in Kiichi never disappears even after Aya, the fire that is his extraordinary blitzing life never runs out, and he as a person is just the fucking greatest. I can't think of another character off the top of my head who is as stupid yet utterly blinding in his ability like Kiichi. The only difference in the new love-struck Kiichi is that instead of pulling off his stunts for the sake of changing the world, he now does it to save and protect the woman he submitted his life to. To some people this might seem half-assed, like Kiichi gave up or that the author just couldn't really figure out a proper conclusion to give Kiichi, which is understandable. The author brings up that he clearly has a lot of problems with the way society operates and is trying to show it through extremely messed up and over-the-top situations, but he never gives solutions either. He's hinted at Kiichi being a dictator towards the ending of the first series, which Kiichi never actually does, but I don't think that's really a proper solution anyways, and not something the author was trying to give. It outlines all these problems at an individual and then greater level, but fails to show how Kiichi can actually solve any of these issues. While I do think the message is strong with what it's trying to showcase as corrupt and wrong, it lacks in its ability to back up this message by giving a response. The closest thing we get to a solid reformation of the country is the seeds Kiichi plants in the newer generation and what the enriched knowledge of those who rise after us can accomplish, but it doesn't actually show anything happening or being accomplished besides a passing of the torch. Ultimately, the story revolves around Kiichi, and in a way, Kiichi's humanization was probably the best way Hideki Arai could have written the story. It's not an issue that one man, no matter how blessed, can solve. One of the most notable quotes that best represents Kiichi's change throughout the series is in chapter 58 when he's conversing with Aya. She talks about how Kiichi never lived alone, which she thinks is incredible. Incredible that the man who doesn't know anything about life is on the brink of changing the world. Kiichi, the boy whose life philosophy has always been to do it if no one else does, has been chasing the restructuring of society forever. He has constantly been battling to change the world, to make a real difference and upset the current setting of power and systems, but in the same way that he's been chasing after his goal, he's never had his own opportunity to experience life. Instead of being a part of the general population, he's always been a leader, always the first person to pave the way for a new path. After Kiichi and the Harumita theater group commit their crimes and start reaching the conclusion points of their plan, Kiichi, or Aya, I couldn't really tell, says something really interesting. They state that it's time for, quote, Kiichi Someya to step back into the spotlight. It's really cool how the quotations of Kiichi's name play into the importance of the symbolism associated with him and his character. His entire life, his name, his personality is boiled down to what he represents to the people in the manga. When Kiichi returns to the Kiichi company, he briefly talks to Akimoto, the woman who originally taught him how to live, to be alone and strong for his parents in heaven. Akimoto says possibly the most important words someone like Kiichi at that moment in time could have heard: to throw it all away, be selfish, and do what he wants with his own life, living solely for himself. Following this conversation, as Kiichi talks to his supporters once more, his final speech to them is how he still wants to live, and he declares his parting with his followers. Kiichi, the man who has always been a symbol, who hasn't lived normally and has yet to experience the royalties and bliss of real life, has finally renounced his position as a symbol and relinquished his status as a token for those who need him. One of the biggest messages that can be taken away from Kiichi is that no one alone can change the world. If a man prophesies for greatness, with support from various people and backed by the biggest media corporation, can't pull the country out by its roots, who actually can? When Kai and Kiichi say they wish to change the country fundamentally, I don't think they are referring to the actual laws and ways society operates. Rather, it's the mindset and individualism of each citizen within the state, to personally be involved with the current affairs and process of politics and not just be a simple cog in the machine. When Kiichi reveals his master plan at the end and his kidnapping of higher-ups, he outlines the faults in Kuga's election as prime minister and how all his promises to fix the country have not and will not come to fruition. He asks for the people, the majority, those who chose him to lead this country, to hold him accountable. The series depicts the downfall of representative democracy and how it fails to reflect the issues of the general population. Problems that are promised to be solved and fixed are just meant to garner votes. The only thing actually achieved are in the interest of the party, of the elites, and of their own benefits. And yet the population which elected its party can't hold the party's actions accountable because they willingly gave them the decision-making power, and as a result, a lot of the issues that stem from political corruption are in a perpetuating cycle that never ends. Kiichi and Kai ultimately fail, or rather give up on their idea of changing the world through their own means, because no matter what Kiichi and Kai do, even if they hold the lives of those with power in their own hands, it doesn't matter if the actual people under the reins of strength do nothing. All of Kiichi's acts, including the kidnapping, which literally upset his entire life goal, was for the sole sake of saving Aya from dirtying herself with murder. It's at this point in the series that Kiichi has thrown all his cards away and rebuked his status as the prophesized man of virility. He is no longer the Kiichi Someya, but just Kiichi, a regular human. In the last few chapters of the series, Kiichi goes through this transformation completely through the most human act of living possible, having sex in the caves of Aokigahara. Kiichi, who had only been seen as a symbol his entire life by those around him, including his closest friends and supporters, has finally been viewed as a human by the woman he truly loves. In this final act, he reflects on what he originally learned from Akimoto, that once you can be thankful for the life you've been given by your parents is when you are truly alive. Kiichi, who has been fighting for revolution his entire life, aiming to upset the state and reset society, now lives not alone or through strength, but is just simply living. This small and short-lived connection he shared with Aya has fulfilled his desires and the life he never got to live, and for once he can laugh without the burden of carrying the country he's fought so hard to shape. Unfortunately, as all good things come to an end, he eventually realizes he can't be a human. He's not and never will be allowed the liberty to live as a regular person. He needs to remain as a symbol till the end, for himself, for those he cares about, and for the prosperous future that seems so far out of reach. In the sea of trees that surround Mount Fuji, a very clear symbol of Japan, Kiichi, who has just been reborn, reclaims his position as a symbol and fights back against the American soldiers ordered by the government to find him. And in the final chapter, the most climactic ending and conclusion the series could have ever had, Kiichi, the man who is alive, lifts his bald fist into the air and in a fit of rage, a final act of defiance, faces an onslaught of bullets as his riddled body gets pushed back full of holes, still standing as his fist remains situated above his head, raised towards the sky as his last act of resentment against the world. Kiichi's death marks the fall of his spirit and the collapse of everything he once symbolized. The revolution he dreamed of may have ended with his life, but his ideals did not. The generation which he nurtured now carries them forward, not with fists raised in violence, but with eyes wide open to a world that still needs changing. Kiichi Someya, the boy born to change the world, ultimately fails at his goal of uptaking the state, but he succeeded in the one thing that mattered to him the most. He proved to his parents and to himself that he was more than a symbol, more than a weapon, and more than what he was destined for. For the first time in his very short and hard-fought life, Kiichi Someya was finally alive. If you watched this far, thank you. Thank you to all 5 Kiichi fans that this video is made for. This manga is super underrated. It's old as fuck, and it just recently got translated by the people who... The translate team is awesome. Shout out to the people who translated it, because this shit could have just gotten lost in Japan and no one in the Western area would have ever read it, but yeah, thanks to them. I did spoil parts of the story, but I think it's still an enjoyable read if you haven't read it yet and you're still here. There's still a lot to uncover in the story, and I probably gave a very angled view on the series. I'm not a super political person. I am young and dumb. I probably got a few or maybe a lot of stuff wrong about anything, so if I did, I apologize. I hope you liked the video regardless. Thank you once again for watching. I fucking really appreciate it. But that's it. Bye.